From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the African and Middle East Division of the Library of Congress. I'm Mary Jane Deeb, Chief of the Division, and I'm delighted to see you all here to attend this presentation, which we are co-sponsoring with the European Division. And Regina is not here at the moment, but she'll be coming. And the presentation is on the Jews of Posen by Mr. Edward David Luft. As most of you already know, our division is made up of 3 sections: the African, the Near Eastern, and the Hebraic sections. We're responsible for materials from 78 different countries in the Near East, Central Asia, the Caucasus, as well as from the entire continent of Africa, North and Sub-Sahara. And also for the Hebraic collections, we're responsible from collections coming from all over the world. We're also very active in acquiring, developing collections, briefing visitors coming from all the countries of the region, and organizing programs, symposia, workshops, exhibits, and so forth. We also invite scholars and experts who have done research and work in our areas of responsibility. And we invite them to share with us their insights and their findings so that all of us attending and participating in the programs leave enriched with new information and a better understanding of the cultures and societies whose publications we collect. Today's lecture is a case in point. Mr. Luft has been working on this book for a number of years here at the Library of Congress and has used resources in this division as well as in many other divisions, including the European Division, including the Geography and Map Division, and we have the Chief of the Geography and Map Division here, Ralph Ehrenberg, the General Collections, HSS, and many other parts of the library as well. And Mr. Luft will tell you more about this in a moment. But now, our very own Sharon Horowitz, the Senior Reference Librarian in the Hebraic section, will introduce Mr. Luft and the program. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary Jane. Good afternoon. On behalf of the Hebraic section and the European Division, welcome to the African and Middle Eastern Reading Room. I especially want to thank the European Division for co-sponsoring today's lecture with us. As you heard, my name is Sharon Horowitz, and I'm reference librarian in the Hebraic section. The Hebraic section marks its beginning in 1912 with the receipt of 10,000 Hebrew books and pamphlets whose purchase was made possible by a gift from New York philanthropist Jacob Schiff. From those humble beginnings, our collections have grown to around 250,000 items in Hebrew, Yiddish, Ladino, Judeo-Persian, and other Hebraic script languages, and our holdings also include an important collection of Amharic books. 2 of our missions in this division are to publicize our collections and to bring people into the library. One way we do that is by holding lectures such as this. Today's speaker, Edward David Luft, is an individual who has lectured and published widely on the topic of Posen Province. Furthermore, because of his scholarly diligence, he is a well-known researcher in the Library of Congress, having done research in many of the library's divisions. Today's presentation is focused on Mr. Luft's book, The Jews of Posen Province in the 19th Century, a project that has kept him busy for 28 years. Mr. Luft graduated with an AB and JD degree from Syracuse University. He spent 2 years in Botswana in the Peace Corps and worked for the New Yorker magazine before coming to DC and working as an attorney for the US government, from which he is retired. I want to express my appreciation to Mr. Cliff Fullwood from Binding and Ms. Deborah Healy from Cataloging for their beyond the call of duty assistance in getting Mr. Luft's book cataloged and bound in an expedited manner. But before I turn the podium over, I have one item of business. This event is being videotaped for subsequent broadcasting. There will be a formal question and answer period after the lecture, at which the audience is encouraged to ask questions and offer comments. Please be advised that your voice and image may be recorded and later broadcast as part of this event. By participating in the Q&A period, you are consenting to the library's possible reproduction and transmission of your remarks. And now, please join me in welcoming our speaker, Mr. Edward David Luft.
First, let me say thank you to Mary Jane and to Sharon for their kind invitation to speak. I'm quite grateful. I'm also grateful to see a relatively large turnout. Some people whose faces I recognize and others who are welcome as well. Before I get started, what I would like to do is tell you a story that would have been contemporary with the 19th century. You probably are aware, or at least many of you will be aware, that the Jews probably could not have survived without humor in the circumstances in which they found themselves. And so this would be a typical story. The old man on his deathbed opens his eyes, sees his son, and asks, "What is that wonderful smell coming from the kitchen?" And the son says, "Mama's making apple strudel." "Oh," says the dying man, "if only I could have some of your mother's apple strudel, I could die a happy man." "I'll get it for you, Papa. I'll get it for you, Papa." And he rushes to the kitchen. A little while later, he comes back very dejected and says, "Mama says the strudel is only for after the funeral." Well, it's good to know that some people still find that sort of thing funny. That would have been typical, and I have other stories of a similar nature that you might find interesting. But let me get started. I do not write out what I speak about. I prefer to do it extempore, basically. And so we'll see how long it lasts, and if it sounds kind of mixed up, maybe if I forget something, I'll go back and tell you later. Let me start here. The picture that you see on the screen is of the administrative district of Posen. And you see it on the top in German and on the bottom in Polish, in abbreviation. And this is the intermediate level of government between the province of Posen and the city of Posen. So we have 3 levels of government, each called Posen. Very confusing. Each had a very clearly defined role, but you had to thread your way through and get to the right office to get the right thing done. Very, very bureaucratic, very Prussian. Let me tell you a little bit about how I came to write the book. I was looking back in 1983, 1984 for a book that I knew had existed at one time, a compilation of what turned out to be 5,134 names of Jews who were naturalized in the Grand Duchy of Posen in 1834 and 1835, based upon a law promulgated by the king in 1833. And on my very last, on the next to the last day of my time in Berlin, I asked in what was then West Berlin at the State Archives, where can I see a copy of that book? And they said, "Oh, we have it." I said, could you please make me a copy? Yes, come back tomorrow. And while I'm standing there, they were making it, and I quick rushed directly to the airplane. When I got home, I decided I saw a need for publication of that book, and although this is not the first edition, this is the revised edition, here it is. And the library, I believe, has 3 copies, actually, plus they have the earlier, the 1987 edition of the book. And we estimate, or at least I estimate, that about 47.8% of those naturalized are represented. That means not that every name is there, but rather essentially every family. Or 47.8% of all of the families, Jewish families in Posen, would be represented. So notice, it's less than half. Not everyone was naturalized as a Jewish citizen, which was not the same thing as full citizenship. It was second or third class citizenship, but it did give some rights. More were given in 1847, and the rest basically didn't occur until after the fall of the kingdom. In other words, until the Weimar Republic was proclaimed. That is not so different from other places. In Britain, they use different criteria, but for example, full professors got 6 votes compared to ordinary citizens who got only 1. And this would have been until, I think, 1921 or something like that in Britain. It has nothing directly to do, but it gives you a comparison. I'm not entirely sure how much the audience knows about the history, so forgive me. You can ask questions at the end if I have lost you. I wanted to show you next, yes. This is Alexander Susskind Bernstein. Isn't it a marvelous portrait? It's owned by a lady who works at the Leo Baeck Institute in New York City and her brother. And supposedly there were originally 13 portraits. Probably one for the wife and 11 children. So far as we know, this is the only one that has survived. It was brought something like in 1934 to the United States. Alexander Susskind Bernstein was the, I guess we would say, sorry, the vice president of the Jewish corporation in Schroeder. And so he was a man of some standing, but he was also obviously a wealthy merchant. And it would have been quite common to have portraits painted like that at that time. To give you some general idea, the book contains 3 maps. This one is of Meseritz, which is in the northeast of Posen. This is the county, or I'm not sure if Kreis is exactly county, but it's something similar. This is a rather rare map from 1848. This is the library's, a reproduction of the library's copy. The book in which it's found is not rare, but the map itself is, because there are many editions of the book, but without the map. The library's copy is with the map, and I hope that they will make a point of securing it for that reason. And this is a kind of busy, difficult to read map, but this is Posen Province in 1905. It's a quite common map that can easily be found online, and you could enlarge it, etc. If you notice, to the right is the Russian Empire, and to the west, of course, would be Berlin and Brandenburg and so on. I wanted to include those in the book. Oh, and by the way, this is the book right here. In four bindings, but it's one book. And it has 14 different chapters plus some additional information. The first chapter is Landsmannschaften. Those are, for those who don't know what that is, those are organizations which looked after the interests of the Jews locally. They were voluntary associations. And so some of them, for example, would make loans. Usually it was a question of burial and burial insurance, but it could have been almost anything that the community felt a need to have. And it might encompass visitations of the sick and so on. That would be Bichur Kolim and other kinds of associations. There is a book published by YIVO in New York, which details at least their holdings in New York, and it may include some other places. I compiled the information from the Jewish Theological Seminary, the Leo Baeck Institute, and various manuscripts listed in holdings of various entities. I think I should tell you that I used resources in the United States, mostly New York and Washington, D.C., but elsewhere. Also Denmark, France, of course, Germany and Poland, and Brazil. I cannot say, of course, that I caught everything, but I tried to catch quite a bit. And you can see it's nearly 2,000 pages. That's why it took me more than 28 years. What I can say is that it's an exhaustive list of Landsmannschaften to the best of my ability. The second chapter deals with Mormon Records, website resources, and especially the Amtsblatt of the Royal Government of Posen. That's an interesting publication in many ways, because in the earlier years, there was no newspaper of general circulation in the province. And as a result, you see ads in the Öffentliche Anzeige, the general notices, which were attached to the Amtsblatt. Amts is a location and Blatt is a newspaper. So it's a local newspaper. I was surprised when I first started to look. The Amtsblätter were published in almost all German-speaking locations. Oh, okay, thanks. The Amtsblätter were published in various locations, usually for every province, thank you, for every province in Posen, in Prussia, but also the Austrians, the Swiss, many others had similar publications, and the Library of Congress has many of these. Also, most of them are now online and can be searched even from your own home. However, you do need some knowledge of German. What really surprised me was that in the Öffentliche Anzeige, the attachment to the Amtsblatt itself, in the early years, one frequently found ads in Hebrew because there was no other place of general availability of this kind of information. That did not continue once there were newspapers of general circulation in the province. Next, I discussed German archival holdings. That's a difficult problem in a way, because on the 29th of January, 1945, the retreating German army set fire to the then Posen archives, burning everything that was in it except for 80 chests of documents which were taken away, and we don't know what happened to those. Perhaps they're in some salt mine or something like that. We don't know. You would think that they probably would have been found by now, if they were going to be found. It's a great loss. But in 1919, a German Jewish archivist inventoried the entire collection and published it. And I have reproduced in my book the listing of what was destroyed. So at least we know what doesn't exist anymore, or if it does exist, has not been found. A great shame, but not everything was in that archives, and so other things that did survive are now in the current archives in Poznań and are available for legitimate researchers. It's amazing what they did manage to collect. And I had lunch once with one archival curator, and he told me just the previous week he came across valuable documents hidden from the Nazis in a barn, and only discovered long after the death of whoever hid those items. So things are sometimes still being discovered. It's getting rarer and rarer, but it is happening. And the Poles have made a determination that they will pretty much put all older archival documents online eventually. But it's such a large collection that it will take many, many years before they finish. Next, I looked at Polish archives, and it's of a similar nature, and mostly available in the state archives in Poznań. But you can't be sure of that because of the various upsets, not only in World War II, but also in World War I, where there was a lot of fighting in Posen Province, today Wielkopolska. Things got displaced. And sometimes they have been shifted to the supposedly correct archive, and sometimes not. So you basically have to look very carefully to see where something is that you want to find. It's serendipitous, and you just have to keep looking. Next, I dealt with Israeli archival sources. Most of the archival resources are in one place in Jerusalem, the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People, but again, not everything. Some things are in strange places. You find archival documents that are not Landsmannschaften related in the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, or in the Leo Beck Institute, or in YIVO, which is in the same building. And I have tried to pull it all together, or as much as I can, to help people understand what they can look for and where, basically trying to make it easier on researchers who want to write books or dissertations, theses, whatever. I also have a listing about onomastics. And again, I tried to be as thorough as possible. I'm sure I missed things, but it's a fairly complete list. And then I went on to city directories with respect to towns that were formerly in Posen. Oh, by the way, on the onomastics, the names, the Prussians had some very specific rules as to adopting names and what names could be adopted, etc. The big difference was, unless it was prohibited by the rules, Jews in Prussia could adopt any name they wanted. That is not necessarily true in some of the other German states, but it was in Prussia. I did try to make an exhaustive list of known city directories so that you can see who is listed. Usually the head of household only, not often anyone else, but remember that widows and spinsters would have been considered heads of households. Generally, that's how you find out about women in city directories. Otherwise, generally not. I'm sure there are some exceptions, but generally not. Please excuse me, I have a cold. I asked a friend of mine, Professor Krzysztof Makowski, who's head of Judaic Studies at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań, what he knew about money, weights, and measures from the period. And he said that he didn't know anything, and he's, the person most likely to know. So as a result, I wrote a chapter on money, weights, and measures, and you can look there to see what would have been the then current currency or units of measurement of various kinds. And so far as I know, it's the only place where that information has been generally collected, although you could probably do the same thing I did and put it together yourself. Next, I worked on all of the Jewish high school graduates in Posen. Most people don't know that the State Library in Berlin, in its second cellar, has the largest collection of yearbooks from high schools in the world. I know they have Scotland, for example, and I don't know specifically, but I have every reason to believe that they would have one of the greatest collections of high school yearbooks, even from the United States. I spent many, many days in that second cellar, and when I got finished, because many of those books hadn't been used in ages, my hands were absolutely black. I photocopied as much as I could, everything that they had, because it lists for boys their names, birth dates, place of birth, father's profession, whether alive or dead, and father's location. Interestingly, though, not the name of the father. And the last entry would be the current situation of the boy when he had left the school. And if there's an asterisk next to his name, that's one thing about the Prussians. They were consistent, and everybody in Prussia had to do the same thing at the same time. And these yearbooks were compiled until 1915, when the war situation became impossible, and so there were none produced in 1916, 17, or 18. In 1919 or 1920, the Poles began again to do that sort of collection, but of course with a very different population in the schools, and some, but very few Jews. I stopped with the German ones in 1915. The thing that's interesting about the lucky girls who managed to go to high school is the father's name is provided, unlike for the boys. So it's a great help if you're doing genealogical research. Keep in mind that girls going to high school are a very privileged group at that time. So the chances of finding somebody, unless they were relatively rich, were small if they were girls. And even the boys, a lot of the boys didn't go, or if they did go, they may well not have graduated high school. But I think that I got every single school, and in some cases, when the State Library in Berlin did not have the information, I went elsewhere and selected it. And although I didn't do the Christians, I turned over the original records, or the photocopies of the original records, to the Leo Baeck Institute, where they can be found in the Edward Luft collection, and you can check on the Christians as well as the Jews. Then comes the main part of my book, which is about 9,000 annotated entries on, from articles, books, whatever, about the Jews of Posen during the period. I included the Library of Congress call number if I found it at the Library of Congress. And by the way, obviously, if it's annotated, I looked at every single item in the book. That's why it took me so long. If I didn't find it here, but I found it at the New York Public, I put in the New York Public Library call number. If I didn't find it there, I looked in the Leo Baeck Institute or in YIVO, both, as I've said, both in the same location, and put in their call number. If not in any of those places, then wherever I did find it and that call number, if it was in the United States, if it was in a foreign country, I indicated not only the name of the holding institution, but also the country. Some of the items are in Portuguese, some in Russian. It's amazing how many different cultures dealt with scholarly articles on the Jews of Posen. I was quite surprised. Maya Bauerban, for example, wrote some articles in Russian. By the way, he also spoke English. And then 2 chapters on maps. The first chapter being maps that that is map series, gazetteers, aerial photographs, and books containing maps of Posen. The second chapter is listings of the maps themselves and the call numbers, because in a large number of cases, I listed maps in the British Library. They have been collecting for far longer than the Library of Congress, and they have a large number of maps that the Library of Congress does not have, but that doesn't mean that it's worth going there necessarily, because the Library of Congress collections and the New York Public Library collections are so good that unless you really need something at of a specific date, you probably can make do with what the Library of Congress has. And if not, almost certainly between the Library of Congress and the New York Public. So unless you want that specific map, you probably don't need to go to London, although I have. The last chapter, the last full chapter, is a chapter on synagogues and cemeteries, because a lot of people have written about those in what is today Wielkopolska. And so for those interested, one can go there. I'll just add something that's not in the book, and that is that so many Jews from Posen migrated to Berlin that when I went through the largest Jewish cemetery in Berlin, Weißensee, I was astounded by how few gravestones were listing people who were not from Posen. It's just amazing what percentage there were in Berlin. So many, in fact, that until the Nazis shut the publication down, there was a publication that was dedicated exclusively to Jews from Posen living in Berlin. The Library of Congress does have a microfilm with most of those issues, and I have tried to list them also there. I want to say something about something else. My friend Angelika Ellmann-Kruger and her husband Dieter, knowing that I was working on Posen, did not dwell very strongly on Posen when they produced this CD. This is the Library of Congress copy. Nearly 32,000 annotated titles on the Jews of Germany from early modern times until the end of World War II. An incredible amount of work, published by Horowitz, one of the leading publishers in Germany. And I would recommend that if you don't find somebody in my book, you might want to look here to see. I had a question earlier about Link and Blond, two different family names. While we didn't find anything in the list of 5,134 people naturalized in Posen, this is probably worth a look under those circumstances to see what there might be. And this would be available through Hebraic section here. Let me just show you one more picture in the book. This is Akiva Eiger, the last Gaon of Posen, walking in a street. This is actually a pastiche, but supposedly it's Posen. It's not. In fact, it's probably Eisenstadt, which is where Akiva Eiger was born in what is today Austria, but at that time was Hungary, in Burgenland. And I don't know which one is which, but the other two are his two rabbinical assistants. I did include a partial list of Posen city death records for Jews. The problem is that in many cases there's no last name, so you have to have some general idea of the person. I did put in as much as I could, and when I found somebody listed in my book, the naturalized Jews, I did note it in the relevant chapter in that book. So that's essentially, by the way, the source of those names from the Posen City Death Register is from a film that the Mormons had, and they had no idea what it was about. None at all, till I told them. So you do find some things, strangely. I don't know what else to tell you. The book ends with a little bit about me and a link to where you can find out some of my work. Perhaps you would like to copy that down. Here is what the page looks like, and there are currently 9 entries. There may be some additional entries in the future, but that is, in my view, some of the most important things to do this kind of research. And again, I don't know how to get back there. Sorry, can you help me get back to the previous page? Good. For those interested, right. For those interested, this is a bibliography of my publications. It is approximately 200 entries, a little bit more. So now, if anyone has any questions, I'll try to respond. Anyone?
Well, thank you very much, and it was a wonderful presentation and very focused on the type of work that we do, which is collect sources and bring them together in a work as you have done. And I'm just curious, why did you set up doing this? What is the motivation that kept you going for 28 years?
Well, the real motivation was the first book. Having discovered it after looking so long and not finding it, it was nowhere in the United States, as it turns out. Later, I discovered that there were actually 2 extant copies, but the more complete copy was at Onomastics Library in Poznań, and I tried to take as much information from that as I could. I believe that it is a complete copy, whereas the one that I found in Berlin was not quite complete. And then it seemed obvious, and it ended up that the tail was wagging the dog, because you can see how much smaller that book is than the 2,000 pages of this one. It was like Topsy, it just growed, you know. And so once I got started, typical Prussian that I am, I just couldn't stop. Until finally I said, okay, that's it. I drew a line underneath and said, I'm not doing any more. Yes, ma'am.
Did you trace your family to Posen?
Oh, yes. Interestingly, none of them lived in the city. I'm sorry?
The main motivation for researching? And what happened to the Jews when the Nazis came?
They were rounded up and sent to death camps, generally. But there weren't very many anymore. Most of them who were going to leave left by 1923. The overwhelming majority went to Berlin. Some went to the Ruhr Valley, especially Essen, and some migrated to the United States, not very many. Okay? I think Darren first.
What percentage of the information came from the Library of Congress?
I never actually calculated it, but I would say the overwhelming majority. Okay, we had some other people. This gentleman?
So the title is The Naturalization.
No, the Jews of, which book? The big one?
I saw one over here on the side, volume 4 maybe, had to do with the naturalization. Oh, the first one.
This one. This one? Well, can everybody see it, or shall I just say it's the naturalized Jews of the Grand Duchy of Posen in 1834 and 1835. Catchy title, right?
Why were they naturalized?
Well, before that time, they weren't considered citizens. And naturalization made them citizens and gave them certain rights. But they had to meet certain criteria in order to be naturalized. Basically, they had to be what the Spaniards would have called hidalgos, sons of somebody. In this case, mostly because they had money. There were restrictions on living in Posen, on marrying, etc., unless they were citizens. And the government took a chance. They had no way of knowing if the Jews would accept the idea of this sort of second-class citizenship. And they were very, very relieved when Akiva Eiger showed up to be naturalized under his German name, Akiva Eiger. And he is in the book, therefore. Professor?
Thanks so much for your dedication for the Jewish history of Posen particularly. So my question is referring about partition, great important partitions here, partitions in the 18th century, and afterward Prussian partitions, first, second. What was the impact, the theological, spiritual, social, judicial impact by Posen Jews in these partitions? They are related to German culture more, to Slavic, Polish, Russian culture. This is one question. Another,
I think we're going to have to just let me answer that one, because otherwise we could be here several years.
Can you repeat the question so that it's recorded?
Yes. Professor David wants to know about the social impact of the three partitions of Poland on the Jews. The Posen Jews were sort of in the middle, if you will, between German Jews and what I'll call the Russian Jews. And so they were not always observant, not always knowledgeable, but they didn't want to admit that. Most German Jews were very proud of the fact that they did not speak Yiddish. Most Posen Jews did speak Yiddish, but especially in later times, might have been reluctant to admit it. And there was always this tension between Reform and Orthodox. There were both congregations in the city of Posen, but the Orthodox was larger. Nevertheless, there were a large number of professionals. Many of those professionals, but not all, were Reformed Jews. There were Orthodox Jews who were professionals, even if we take out the rabbis, who, of course, would be more heavily represented among Orthodoxy. Yes, sir?
At its height, do we know what the Jewish population was of Posen?
That is a matter of some debate, which I discussed in this book. If I'm doing this out of my head, but if I remember, I estimated that it's about 55,000.
Oh, it's not that large.
No, and yet it is a huge percentage of the Jews of Germany. Keep in mind that at its greatest extent, German Jews were only 600,000 in 60 million. But if you read the book Deutschland ohne Juden, or in English, Germany Without Jews, you can see an examination of the impact that the Jews had on German society. I would recommend that book. And by the way, it's written by a Christian, not by a Jew. Basically, it's very difficult. If you not only look at which Jews from Germany obtained Nobel laureates, but also look at those whose Doktorvater, the faculty advisor of those who won Nobel Prizes among Germans, it rises to an astounding 99%. By the way, you have to carve out those who won Nobel laureates in literature, which makes some sense because, after all, we're talking about German culture there. But in the sciences and in the social sciences, which the Germans don't always distinguish between those two, there's one word in German, it's 99%. Now, remember, this is not just Jews. This is those who are either Jews or whose faculty advisor was a Jew. That's a little bit off my topic, but I thought it's worth mentioning. Yes, sir?
Mr. Luft, a related question on the population. Expressed as a percentage before the migration you described in the time it was arrested, what percentage of, say, Poznan City and Poznan Province were Jews?
I don't know, and we know that as early as 1800, there was an out-migration of Jews out of Posen. So you'd have to know which year and then look at the censuses. There are census records that the Germans kept to tell exactly that, and you could also look at the minority census of 1939 compiled by the Nazis to see how many Jews were left at that time in that portion of Posen, which was still part of Germany, because not all of it was. The Rump area was put together as Posen Westpreußen and made into an administrative area, basically a province.
I realize that you're the expert and I'm a generalist, so I was hoping for a sort of general kind of figure.
Never more than 10%. But you'd have to know the specific year, et cetera. But all of that is knowable. You could look it up. Anything else?
I wanted to ask another question, and perhaps, excuse my ignorance, but why were the boys' fathers' names not mentioned on the records of the schools? You said the girls were, but not the boys.
Well, the girls were going to get married and not have a profession. The boys presumably would have a profession, and that was the German bureaucracy's way of dealing with it. I don't really know. I can only speculate. And after all, the surname will be the same. And they're not really interested in the father, although, interestingly, they're very interested in the father's profession. They're interested in the boy who graduated. Some of whom, by the way, if they have that asterisk after their name, are even excused from taking the final oral examination because their grades are so high, et cetera. But, and therefore I presume that it would be quite well documented who they were and where they came from, et cetera. We know, of course, the town in which they came, from which they came, and the father's town, which is usually but not always the same. And some of those people, usually non-Jews, but not only, would come from Russia or other places to be educated. It could be, and commonly those high schools taught as second languages French and English. Later, there were Jewish religion teachers, just like Catholic and Protestant religion teachers. And in some of the larger schools, there was 2 tracks, German or Polish. So those were pretty liberal places for the times. But the rules about what went into the yearbook were set in Berlin, not locally. So they didn't have any choice about what they reported.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If Mr. Luft has energy and anyone wants to talk to him about more personal or extensive questions, I think he'll stay and talk to you later. But I just want to thank you all for coming and thank Mr. Luft.
Thank you for having me.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.